Hi, thank you so much for joining me. This is Gary Zacharias with the Apologist bookshelf. Os Guinness is a wonderful speaker. He's a wonderful writer, just very thorough, makes you really think as you read his material. And he has a book out called Unspeakable, subtitled Facing Up to Evil in an Age of Genocide and Terror. He calls it a guide to life's greatest challenge. And it is. Every time anybody asks, why aren't you a Christian, or what's a big challenge to Christianity, the problem of evil and pain and suffering comes up. So this is Os Guinness's book dealing with that, facing up, as he says, to evil. And so I've done chapter 7 and I've done chapters 9. I would like to, eventually just walk through this book. So I'm going to start in the first chapter. It's called Evil and the Examined Life. And he says there are two deep issues that humans face. One is the raw evil of the inhumanity of humanity. And then the second question, another issue, is where's God when it comes to this human suffering? So the things we do to each other, and then, of course, where's God when all of this happens? Kind of like quite a bad things happen to good people. And he says the events of September 11th, he said when that hit, it said America and the West were trying to deal with this, and it said it was such a terrible time. The responses to evil were weaker, they're more controversial, they're more confused than they had been for centuries. So that's really sad. It says that what happened pretty much was after September 11th, it destroyed the last threads of the Enlightenment belief that people are getting better and better. Haven't we heard that before? Yeah, things are getting better. They said that, of course, one of the big ironies was they were saying that around 1900. They said, the 20th century is going to be a wonderful century where we're conquering disease, where people are getting richer, working conditions are improving, and on and on. And then what happened? 1914 to 1918, millions were killed. Oh, well, that was the war to end all wars. No. Unfortunately, World War II came, and after that, they set up the United Nations. Oh, that'll take care of it. No. Then we had just terrible fighting going on ever since then. So getting back to his book here, he said, there are 4 troubling facts, and this is what this first chapter really focuses on, that make up a challenge to try to rethink evil and suffering in our times. So here are the 4 troubling facts. Number 1, he says the scale and the scope of evil has increased a great deal in the modern world. I mean, you look at September 11th, he said that's just part of a wider record of all the terrible things that we do. I mean, he goes back, he says, think about the Ottoman massacre of over 1 million Armenians in World War I, about the Rwandan and Sudanese massacres in the 1990s. You've got the Ukraine, you've got Auschwitz, the rape of Nanking. He just rattles these things off. The Soviet Gulag, the Chinese Cultural Revolution. How about Cambodia, the killing fields there? Massacres in Bangladesh and Yugoslavia. And he says if you just total up the number of deaths just in the wars, you're over 100 million. And he says more than 100 million more were killed by their fellow human beings in political repression or massacres or genocide. So the whole scale, I mean, you can tell the evil has increased tremendously in this world. It's so sad to think about that. He says, secondly, so first point was the scale and scope of evil has really increased lately. Secondly, he says modern people have demonstrated a very poor response to modern evil. We're starting to see these atrocities as they happen, but people who are in leadership positions and decent people knew what was going on, but they did very little. We all tend to be bystanders now. We often know enough to know it's better not to know more, he said. When the Tutsis were crying for help in 1994, the watching world just took a look and said, and they turned away. He said not a single country went to their rescue. They said that was the response from a generation that came up with the word genocide and made a big deal about human rights and built memorials like the Holocaust Museum so we'd never forget. He said the civilized world would say, never again after the Nazis. He said, actually, probably a better statement is, you never know. So we've got people watching and seeing these things happening, but modern people aren't getting involved. Poor response, he says, to evil. Here's a third thing that he says is going on. Modern people have a chronic inability to just name and judge evil and to respond effectively. It says the Western world was off guard with the September 11th attack. It was caught off guard intellectually and morally. It was evil. I mean, how evil would that be? George Bush said today our nation saw evil, but his critics at once said, oh, anybody who thinks of evil and talks about it that way, that's simplistic. That's old-fashioned. Evil has been so politicized, it's not even a moral term anymore. It says, and besides, people use it, that leads to self-righteousness, according to some. But said it was a turn of the president's supporters to get upset when we started seeing pictures of American soldiers as torturers themselves in some of the camps that they'd set up for the Muslims. So, it's all over the place. They don't want to call it evil. A long time ago, there was a psychologist, Carl Menninger. He said, whatever became of sin? So he said, why are we so confused? Why can't we call things evil? He said, well, one thing is progressivism in philosophy and politics has replaced evil with some kind of utopian view of human goodness. And it's led so many people, and in fact entire societies, to think that individuals are just getting better and better. It's this upward march to peace and prosperity. He says you get the form of therapeutic revolution, and talking cures has claimed to offer alternative explanations and remedies for human dysfunctions. It's just something psychological, right? It's not really evil. He said we have sort of a Pollyanna view in popular culture that Americans tend to look on the bright side of everything, and they plaster life with rainbows and smiley buttons. Yeah. And he says most recently you got postmodernism, and it pushes relativism, and it wants to do away with truth claims. It says those are just disguised bids for power. So you have a bunch of people who pronounce any judgment about evil, that's evil itself, to make some kind of pronouncement. He says some people have even acted as if it's worse to judge evil than to do evil. But he said the confusion actually even goes deeper. It says philosophy hasn't lived up to its promise of helping our lives with reason. It doesn't really have any answers. It said not a single answer has been given to these key questions over the last 2,000 years of what it means to be human and where our problems are and how to fix it. He said we're seeing a grand fading of the power of moral law. So what's happened? Moral certainties have been assaulted. They've been tossed. And modern evils have exhausted our minds. We can't understand, and our judgments, we can't seem to resolve any of these things. And modern evil, he says, has really called into question progress and morality and humanity. Yeah. It says, humankind, this is a quote from a philosopher, humankind has lost faith in itself. He said, this philosopher says, contemporary evil left us helpless. Now, he's made 3 points. Let me get to the fourth one, but I just want to remind you what his 3 points are. So 4 troubling facts, he said, going on right now. Way more evil. It's just a huge increase in evil. Number 2, people don't have a good response to modern evil. What are we going to do about it? And then 3rd, we can't name and judge evil. We can't even call something evil. He says number 4 is probably the most controversial of all these statements. The worst modern atrocities that we're witnessing, they're perpetrated by secularist regimes and led by secularist intellectuals and in the name of secular beliefs. He says, see, that goes against what we really believe in educated circles these days. Most people make the opposite claim. Gore Vidal one time said, the great unmentionable evil at the center of our culture is monotheism. I want you to think about that one. So Gore Vidal says, any monotheist belief, in other words, a religious belief, there is the middle of evil. But notice what Os Guinness is saying, the worst atrocities are committed by secularists. Richard Dawkins said something like Gore Vidal, only the willfully blind fail to implicate the divisive force of religion in most, if not all, of the violent enmities of the world today. Here's a British journalist. Remember President Bush said there's an axis of evil? Well, one British journalist said the real axis of evil is, you ready for this? Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And then Os Guinness says, not so fast. He says, actually, monotheism is the single most influential and constructive belief in human history. And it says the links between 20th century massacres and the secular individuals and the secular beliefs, it's undeniable. It's undeniable. So he says, think about the Young Turks back at the turn of the century in Turkey itself, and Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot. More people, this is important for us to always remember when we're talking to others, more people in the 20th century were killed by secularist regimes led by secularist intellectuals and in the name of secularist ideologies than in all the religious persecutions in the entire history of the Western world. So let's think about that for just a minute. Take all the secularists, put them on one side of a page, put all the religious people on the other side of religious ideas, and add up who's killed who. Now, it's a shame, and of course it doesn't sound good to say, yeah, people were killed in the name of Christ. That's true. Doesn't mean those were Christians that were doing it, but they did do it under his name in many cases. But you put on the other side the secularists, and like he said, you got Stalin and Mao, and I'd add Hitler to that. He didn't put him here, but Hitler was no Christian. He was no believer in Christianity. He thought it was too gentle. He wanted something tougher. So you put Stalin, and you put Mao, and you put Pol Pot, and on and on. The most deaths came about because of secular regimes. If there's no God, think about that. If there's no God, you're not responsible. Nobody's going to be looking over your shoulders. You do some of these terrible things. Okay, then he's got another section here. He said, if we're going to think about the challenges of evil and suffering, now I think this is really good to do in an opening chapter, what are the basic questions that he's going to wrestle with? So he's laying out kind of a forecast for the rest of the book. 7 basic questions when we're going to think about evil and suffering. Number 1, where does evil come from? That's always been a mystery. You know, where are we getting evil? Where is it coming from? Number 2, what's so right about a world so wrong? He said, where's God? How can I stand these things? Right? The world seems so wrong. Number 3, are we really worse, or are we just modern? So we got to understand evil today, the way it's minimized pain today and magnified destructiveness. Number 4, do the differences make a difference? Right? So in other words, the different kinds of answers that you give to the problem of evil and suffering, would that make a difference if they were acted upon? Number 5, isn't there something we can do? Are there some actions? 6, why can't I know what I need to do? Right? We don't really have good answers. And number 7, isn't there any good in all this bad? Is there any kind of positive side to all this evil and suffering? So I think that's a good way to do it. He said, you know, people talk about using reason to solve all of our problems. He said there are limits to reason. There are things we just don't know and we can't understand. Evil defies definition. It's a mystery, and sometimes it really is unspeakable. That's the title of his book. But he said, on the other hand, in a day of careless tolerance, there's got to be some limit to respect. You know, it says the right to believe anything doesn't mean that anything anyone believes is right. He said, many an evil would have done none of its damage if it had been challenged when it got started. Okay, so I want to stop and hit that one again. He says, much of the evil that we see today would not have done the damage if it had been stopped as it got started. I mean, think about Nazism and Stalinism and things like that. He said, there's a key question that comes up, of course. Why do bad things happen to good people? But he said there's a second question with that. What does it say of us as humans that the people who do these things are just like we are? They're in the same species. Wow. Yeah, those are really difficult. So that wraps up the chapter there. Do I want to get into one more chapter? Where on earth does evil come from? Yeah, okay, let's do that. We'll do this real quickly here. He said, so his next chapter is called Question 1, Where on Earth Does Evil Come From? So he said there are 3 sources, basically. It's our bodies, nature, and other human beings. Okay, so now he's going to move on here. Our bodies, let's start talking about that. Our bodies as being a source of evil. He said we are mortal. And he says that's just realistic. We're small, we're weak, we're vulnerable. Somebody once said, I guess Epicurus, the philosopher, when it comes to death, we all live in an unwalled city. Now, we can't change that reality, can we? Be nice if we could, but we could choose different reactions to it. So one of the terrible features, he says, of mass murders in modern times is their assumption of the ease with which they can slaughter and dispose of the human body. We've got gas chambers and mass graves and killing fields and torture rooms. It's so easy to get rid of that. He said, we can't deny human vulnerability. He said, even in the West here, where everything's about health and fitness and beauty, but he said, that's an illusion. A rabbi in Los Angeles said, in L.A. there's no autumn. People do not wish to age. They want to be young up to the day they die. Aging, with its insinuation of the end, is terrible to the city of illusions. And he said, thinking of the human body, our minds are vulnerable to decline and decay just as our bodies are. Pretty sad. He says the vulnerability of our bodies reminds us we need to make a more careful distinction between evil and suffering in our explanation. He said, we've been putting them together like they're the same thing, evil and suffering. But he said, we'll look at the differences between them. So here's a question as he begins to wrap up the end of this chapter. How can human beings be so great and so weak, so noble and so vile, so consequential in their deeds and so fleeting in their lives? Yeah, so that's the end of that chapter. He doesn't spend a lot of time on that. But then he moves to the next chapter. I'm going to save that one. I think it's how we have natural disasters in the world as well. Well, you know what? It's a short chapter. Let me go ahead, because that's really short. He says, think about natural and natural disasters. You have famines and things like that. You have tsunamis. And he said, the second of the three sources of evil. First was our bodies. Now it's nature and natural disasters. He said, large natural disasters let us know, we're in trouble. So we can sometimes keep the worst at bay, but he said, think about our history, fires and floods and storms and hurricanes and tornadoes and on, that we can have this huge sudden disaster and just take us out. And they seem to come right out of the blue, and we feel so helpless. And they said, there's no more heartwarming sight than a fire in the hearth, but the roar of a forest ablaze is terrifying. So he says natural disasters create chaos, they create havoc. And he said we need to underscore the lesson of realism, right? Natural disasters strike terror in us. Why? There's so little that we can do. Somebody once called them nature's terrorists. They seem mindless and merciless. They make us feel jumpy at home. And he said, of course, natural disasters raise all sorts of questions for people who believe in a personal God, who looks after his people and his providence, and they're even called sometimes an act of God. How could God be just, let alone benevolent, if you have disasters that come on the innocent and the guilty alike? So he says secularists believe everything in the universe comes from chance and eventually moves toward ultimate extinction. So he said that's kind of weird. They have a hope based on human progress. That's whistling in the dark against final futility, I guess. All right, so he's covering that, and then he's going to spend more time on the next chapter, and I'm going to stop here. Next chapter is what's the greatest of these three evils. So one is our body, second are natural disasters, the third one is other human beings. We do such terrible things to each other. So I'll cover that in the next podcast. But it's a wonderful book to read. I say wonderful, it's sad to know what we're doing to each other, but it does give us hope as Christians. So the book again is called Unspeakable. The author is Guinness. A good book to have. So it's one of those books that you'll wrestle with. It won't necessarily come easy and be some simplified, here's what you need to do. No, it's a serious book, but you'll get a lot out of it if you tackle it. Thanks, and see you later.